Upgrades are the cornerstone of basically any action game or RPG. No matter the precise nature of a gameplay loop, these games will almost universally dole out skills, abilities, and new weapons throughout the game, which constantly give the player fancy new toys to work with. And while developers generally invest a lot of time and hard work into ensuring these upgrades are more satisfying than what came before, it has to be said that they don't always get the balance right. Whatever the reason, these upgrades fell flat with a large number of players, who perhaps swore off using them entirely if possible, or in the case they were mandatory, rued the day the developers ever thought they were a good idea. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video game upgrades that made everything worse. Number 10. The Ring of the Lucii, Final Fantasy XV. If you played Final Fantasy XV on launch, you'll likely remember the Ring of the Lucii as the item that made the game's dreaded 13th chapter, in which most of Noctis's powers and abilities are taken away and he's stalked by a glut of foes, just about tolerable. Ring magic could save your hide in a pinch, but with the release of the game's 1.07 patch a few months later, the Ring of the Lucii was given a major buff. The ring's now ultra-powerful spells trivialized not only this chapter, but also the rest of the game. And because the patch also allowed you to bring the ring into New Game Plus, many players found it to be simply straight up overpowered. It's dangerously close to game-breaking in how easy it makes combat, and though you're under no obligation to use it outside of Chapter 13, the temptation was surely too great for many. After all, you can even use the buffed ring to effortlessly slay Adamantoids, one of the game's most powerful enemies, in a matter of seconds. If you want to play the game post-patch and retain any sense of challenge, you're better off using the ring during that mandatory passage only, if you have that much self-control. Number 9. Shock Gloves, Batman Arkham Origins. Though much of the thrill of the Batman Arkham games lies in the wish fulfillment aspect of playing as a technologically souped-up Dark Knight, many fans felt that Arkham Origins edition of Shock Gloves was a head-scratching misstep. Though the Shock Gloves, electrified gauntlets which let you make mincemeat out of even armored enemies, were first seen in Wii U's Armored Edition of Arkham City, they made their first proper franchise debut in Arkham Origins. With Arkham Origins being a prequel to Arkham Asylum and Arkham City, it was largely expected that the game would pare down Batman's gadgets and skills to let players control a scrappier, more wet-around-the-ears Batman. But that's not really what happened. Even if you can accept the bizarreness of Batman's shock gloves mysteriously disappearing in the chronologically subsequent Arkham games, the shock gloves' presence in Arkham Origins simply makes Batman too powerful for his own good. The series' sublimely fluid combat is undermined by these weapons, obtained by defeating the Electrocutioner, which allow you to build combos and deal out insane amounts of damage at high speeds. The general consensus that the gloves are absurdly overpowered is likely why they never returned for the series' most recent game, Arkham Knight. Number 8. Phase Locket, Shovel Knight. If you've played much of Shovel Knight at all, you'll know it's a tenaciously challenging game, and for the most part, that's how fans like it. Except the game can be made considerably easier by basically abusing the Phase Locket, a relic found early in the game which allows players to become temporarily invisible and phase through obstacles and enemies. Though the Locket requires use of finite magic and won't save you in all situations, it does nevertheless give the player a major leg up during some of the game's trickiest boss encounters, especially if you know how to use it in clever and creative ways. Considering the Locket works for several seconds and has no cooldown time, the potential for egregious use speaks for itself. Again, the simple solution is just not to use it, but considering how fiendishly difficult some parts of this game are, you really can't blame people for lacking the restraint to not use it, even if it tips the balance of making the game a little too easy. Number 7. Fruit Bazooka, Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. On paper, a bazooka that fires Wumpa fruit sounds like the most awesomely on-brand thing ever for the Crash Bandicoot franchise, yet the third game's fruit bazooka weapon, unlocked after defeating boss N. Jin, isn't nearly as fun as it sounds. Sure, it's a supremely powerful projectile weapon which can make short work of most enemies and obstacles, but there's one major design flaw. You're forced to stop dead in your tracks to use it. You can't move and operate the bazooka at the same time, and worse still, the aiming reticule is painfully slow to line up. For a game so explicitly centered around breathless, relentless movement, it's actively less fun to rely on the fruit bazooka throughout the rest of the game. It has its uses, sure, but it also flies wildly in the face of Crash Bandicoot's overall design philosophy: move often and move fast. As a result, many only use the fruit bazooka when absolutely necessary. Number 6. Flying Dodge, Dead Rising. Though the 2016 remaster of Dead Rising promised a tasty 1080p resolution and 60 FPS, it apparently came at quite the quality of life cost to the core gameplay. The original release of the game included an unlockable ability called Flying Dodge, which is basically exactly what you'd expect. Double tap the analog stick in the desired direction to perform an acrobatic dodge away from incoming zombies. Simple, right? Except on the remastered release, players reported frequently performing the flying dodge whether they wanted to or not. It's been theorized since the remaster's release that this was due to the remaster doubling the original's frame rate and incorrectly counting a player's single analog tap as 2 quick taps. Whatever the reason, players who unlock the flying dodge will find themselves regularly randomly performing the move in the middle of traversal and combat. Needless to say, it's incredibly annoying. Arguably enough to stop playing the game altogether. Thankfully, Dead Rising 2 changed the flying dodge's control scheme, instead requiring players to simply click in the left analog stick, which eliminated the problem. For the first game though, it sucks. Number 5. Mimic Tear Ash, Elden Ring. During the first few weeks of Elden Ring's release, there were 3 words being spoken among struggling players online: Mimic Tear Ash. The Mimic Tear Ash is a spirit ability to summon a clone of yourself, as proves hugely advantageous during combat. You see, the clones aren't merely dummies intended to act as a diversion. They can do basically anything the player can, and in some cases, even solo smaller bosses by themselves as a result. As difficult as Elden Ring is, it wasn't long before players forced themselves to admit that the Mimic Tear Ash was outrageously OP. It didn't exactly turn boss fights into pure child's play, but it did make them significantly easier. For a From Software game where players expect a major amount of pushback, it felt like a bridge too far, diminishing the sense of achievement from persevering for hours against a tricky foe. When you can let an AI double do half the work, it feels a bit like skipping over the real meat of the game's difficulty. And the developers evidently felt the same, as a few weeks after Elden Ring's release, From Software gave Mimic Tear Ash a substantial nerf, ensuring your double could withstand markedly less damage and therefore function best as a decoy. As gutted as many initially were by the nerf, it was probably for the best, all things considered. Number 4. Skells, Xenoblade Chronicles X. A possibly hot take incoming here, but Xenoblade Chronicles X's Skells, gigantic mechs unlocked midway through the game, which can be used for combat and exploration, can actually make the experience a lot less fun. Though there's certainly a neat novelty to the Skells when you first gain access to them, soon enough the temptation arises to use them for basically everything, no matter how easy it makes much of the game's combat, and that on-foot exploration feels more in the spirit of the adventure, so to speak. Skells can also be upgraded with a flight module, which makes getting around the planet Mira even quicker and easier, which, while awesome for a time, again trivializes traversal to an arguably excessive extent. Skells are in theory a great mechanic that suffer from poor balancing, such that players might have to talk themselves into just not using their Skell from time to time. Number 3. Clutch Claw, Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Though Monster Hunter World expansion Iceborne was largely well received by fans, there remains the vocal sentiment among many that the inclusion of a new gadget, the Clutch Claw, severely undermined the game's fluid combat system. In theory, the Clutch Claw is insanely badass. Upon throwing it at an enemy, you then launch yourself towards them and attach to the side. And when clutched to your monster of choice, you can deliver devastating damage with your weaponry. Yet Capcom's decision to make the Clutch Claw mechanic mandatory is a major thorn in Iceborne's side, due to the finicky nature of the weapon, meaning it'll often hit an unintended part of the monster's body or even miss entirely. As such, using it feels unintuitive and time-consuming, making hunts slower and breaking up the free-flowing nature of the combat otherwise. It's such a pain to use that it actively makes Iceborne, an otherwise terrific expansion filled with awesome new content, a genuine chore to play at times. Thankfully, Capcom did away with it entirely in the recent Monster Hunter Rise, replacing the clutch claw with the infinitely superior wire bug. Number 2. X-Buster, Mega Man X3. Mega Man X3 is one of the more divisive entries into the franchise, and that's in large part due to the rather underwhelming powers and upgrades available. And nothing stings more than seeing what Capcom did to the legendary X-Buster weapon in this game. The upgrade, if we can call it that, adds another charging level, meaning that charging a full shot takes way too long in the heat of battle. As cool as the upgraded X-Buster shot might look, function trumps fashion every single time, and in that case, the regular X-Buster is the easy winner. More than perhaps any other upgrade on this list, it actually feels like a downgrade and makes Mega Man X3 genuinely less appealing to play through. You're not obliged to get the upgrade, of course, and thankfully Capcom didn't commit to this upgrade path in future games, but it truly cements X3 as being far from a fan favorite entry in the series. Number 1. Insta-Kill, Persona 5. And finally, we have Ryuji's Rank 7 Confidant skill Insta-Kill from the original release of Persona 5. The upgrade allows players to immediately obliterate a weak shadow they come into contact with, which, while in theory is awesome, is entirely sullied by the fact that you won't get any XP, money, or item drops for these kills. Naturally, if you're grinding for cash or items, this is majorly infuriating, especially as insta-kill can't be deactivated in any way. And so those who played the game upon release recommend that later players avoid reaching rank 7 for this reason. Fan criticism was vocal enough that Atlus actually listened and gave insta-kill a makeover for Persona 5 Royal, where it would net players some XP, give them the potential to obtain items, and also let them get the persona. Plus, insta-kill was rendered optional in Royal, meaning those who had no fondness for it simply didn't have to use it despite being rank 7. That's the end of our list, but do let me know down in that comment box if you can think of any other video game upgrades that made everything worse. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonnell, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more gaming goodness.